When I was 8 years old, my parents took my brother and me to the circus. While they waited in line for tickets, we played on the wheelchair ramp handlebars like they were monkey bars. We liked to climb and hang from them. But my brother and I didn't always get along, and we ended up getting into a small argument. He shoved me into the handlebar. My left shoulder hit the bar, but my automatic reaction wasn't a feeling of physical pain. It was a feeling of loss in my right arm. I could feel that my left arm was cold from the metal and sore from the impact, but none of that was in my right arm. I was unbalanced. I was uncomfortable. My heart started to beat faster and my chest started to tighten. I needed the feelings in my left arm to exist in my right. So I got up and I ran myself into that bar, this time making sure to hit it with my right arm. But embarrassingly, I ran too quickly. I hit the bar too hard. So I got up again, and this time I made sure to hit it with my left arm. It was hard to ensure that my arms felt exactly the same, so I had to run into that bar multiple times, which left me with bruises so severe that I had to go to physiotherapy. When I was a child, I deduced that everything with respect to one's body needed to be symmetrical. If I touched something with my left hand, I automatically assumed I needed to repeat that action with my right. If this need for balance didn't come forth, I believed bad things would follow. I am not exactly sure what these bad things were, but I knew I was never willing to wait to find out. I'll explain what this feels like. It's like being underwater for an extended period of time. You're holding your breath, and it's scary. And without even thinking about it, your body naturally tells you that bad things will happen if you stay underwater. Your body tells you to fight to get out of that situation. That's the way my body felt every time I touched something asymmetrically. This feeling is not desirable, so I always touch things 2, 4, even 8 times if necessary. This should have been an obvious indicator that I was different, but just like breathing, I honestly thought everyone did these things. I didn't even tell my parents I did these things. I thought nothing of my childish games that sought symmetry and relief. Just like younger Samantha, who was clearly unaware of her disorder, society often misinterprets the true meaning of OCD. I have searched the hashtag OCD on Instagram, and here are just a few examples of what you can find. OCD is an organized closet. OCD is an adjective you can use to describe the level of clean you can have your car. Apparently, OCD is also aesthetically appealing, organized M&M candies. Sometimes people can even be OCD-ish. And this last one's my personal favorite. Instagram now diagnoses people OCD-ing. Posts like this make me cringe. What is OCD really? OCD is obsessive compulsive disorder. It's one of many anxiety disorders, and it all starts with the obsessions. The obsessions are the recurring uncomfortable thoughts and worries that lead to the compulsions. The compulsions are in response to those obsessions, attempting to satisfy them. And it becomes a disorder when your obsessions and compulsions take up so much of your time that you're unable to move through your day normally. I have obsessive compulsive disorder. My OCD manifests itself in a number of ways, but the 3 main concepts that I wrangle with are symmetry, perfectionism, and time management. The symmetry theory that I developed as a child has followed me to date. To this day, I am still terrified that bad things will happen if my interactions with objects occur in an asymmetrical manner. I spend a good portion of my time touching things twice or avoiding touching things at all. Ideally, I'd be able to go through the day touching nothing. This need for symmetry often moves beyond the physical and takes shape within my mind as well. While walking on city streets or even within my own home, I avoid the lines on the ground because I believe I can feel them beneath my feet. There is nothing scarier than the grout between the kitchen and bathroom tiles. Conveniently, I get to stand up here walking around on a carpet. I avoid door handles because the cold metal sensation takes a lot for me to recuperate from. Anytime I'm itchy, I'm really twice as itchy. Anytime anyone pats me on the back or shakes my hand, I have to fix it. Any sort of physical encounter requires a great deal of remediation. An average day for me means avoiding 32 different sections of lines on the ground, 60 fixes for any time anyone touches me or bumps into me, mentally preparing for 124 door handles, 270 casual encounters anytime I have to touch something, and 420 itches. In total, that's 906 obsessive-compulsive thoughts that occur within one day. And that's only symmetry related. I'm also a perfectionist. Growing up, I spent hours ensuring that my binders were nothing short of a perfectly color-coded textbook. I had a number of very specific rules that needed to be followed. Just a few included. All notes from one subject must be taken in a minimum of 2 colors. Notes must appear aesthetically balanced. The handwriting, the pen, and the paper must remain the same through the entire year. Absolutely no food stains, no grease stains, no creases, no crinkles, and in subjects where it was possible, notes should be retyped at home. I was always developing new rules for myself, and in the 9th grade, I decided that the best way to have a consistent binder was to have typed notes. But I didn't have a laptop, so I took handwritten notes in class, I came home, and I typed my notes out on a desktop. I printed them, and I put them in my binder. And if at any point these notes became creased or crinkled, which of course they did, I would take them out of my binder, place them on my mother's ironing board, and iron them. I spent hours doing this. If at any point I looked down at my binders and I didn't see perfection, my heart would instantly begin to beat faster. My chest would tighten. I was so anxious that it hurt. It was easier to deal with my binders than to live with my own anxiety. But then I started university. In university, you don't have time to type up your notes or iron them. So I stopped taking them, which, as you can imagine, had an adverse effect on my grades. But it doesn't end there. I also spend a great deal of my time on time management-related OCD. I always mentally prepare for my day. I always have a plan. I even plan to plan my next plan. Whenever I have work to do, I look at the number of tasks I have to do, the number of days I have to do it in, take 1 from the number of days to, of course, allot for error, divide the number of tasks by this new number of days, and bam, I have a perfectly balanced week with proportionate amounts of work for every day. Conveniently, I have a degree in mathematics, so these minor daily calculations are fairly trivial. However, I often find myself in situations where I am incredibly anxious because I don't know where my day is going to lead me. Life doesn't always go as planned. The large theme within my OCD gravitates towards balance. It's fundamental in my symmetry, my perfectionism, and in the way I organize my day. Now you may be asking yourselves, why or how does this add any real value or meaning into my everyday life? The need to double tap items, myself, and even unfortunately other people, can truly be seen as a disadvantage. And while there are moments in my life that I would definitely agree with you, there is an overall understanding within me that life has a need for balance. Too often, I hear people refer to OCD casually as a joke or as a deficiency. OCD keeps me balanced. How many people can say they live a balanced life? I can assure you, this need for balance is not something that I came up with for the convenience of this talk. It's prominent throughout many cultures and traditions. Aristotle defined a healthy life as one with a balanced soul, with neither excesses nor deficiencies. In life, we all rely on balance to help ground us, to help make important decisions. My manifestation of balance is no doubt a compulsion to satisfy my disorder, but it does construct a mental model within me, one that guides me to lead a healthy life. Growing up, I maintained my work in such a way that would ensure balance and consistency. I rewrote notes. Yes, this took a lot of extra time and energy, but it was so beneficial to my learning. Repetition is generally a study tactic that teachers advise students to do, something my disorder forced me to do, making me naturally a good student. Again, rewriting, retyping notes, lots of time, lots of energy. But it speaks to my fundamental nature. I believe everything I do and produce is a direct reflection of me. So I always try my best. I habitually give 110%. But at some point, as I said, my best stopped making sense. In university, I did stop taking notes. But then my dad gave me an iPad. I learned to take handwritten notes on an iPad. My notes were never crinkled or creased. They never had food or grease stains on them. And if I needed to, I could print these notes. This changed my life. This is a skill I've been able to share with students, colleagues, and friends. Students have different learning needs, and for some of them, the use of an iPad is beneficial. I have helped a number of different students adapt their learning to use an iPad as their primary note-taking device. But more importantly, through my OCD, I learned to be adaptable and open to new ideas. My need to equally distribute my work week may be quirky, but it's healthy. I regularly have time for work, leisure, and exercise. Over the years, I've strongly minimized doing last-minute work as the thought of an impending deadline gives me increased levels of anxiety, which generally means I produce better work. I often hear the expression, I work better under pressure. I have OCD. I am literally always under pressure. OCD has given me so many positives, but when I went to the doctors for help, they immediately offered me medication, and I strongly thought about taking it. But then I realized that so much of me is rooted in my OCD that I didn't want to get rid of it. I just wanted to handle it better, and ideally, one day, embrace it. All of my ambition and my intensity comes from my OCD, and I need that to be successful. Society and its need to normalize everyone is an attempt to create a standard we should all fit into, one that I just don't fit into. It's disheartening to think that anxiety disorders are seen as exclusively negative. As a community, we are becoming addicted to quick fixes like drugs, and we are not taking the time to appreciate the benefits of these conditions. I said no to drugs and said yes to CBT, cognitive behavior therapy. I am not here to say that anti-anxiety medication is unacceptable. I just felt that I would have lost a small piece of me if I had taken it. Doctors have told me I have an obsessive-compulsive disorder, but I prefer to call it an obsessive-compulsive advantage. Thank you.
Eight. That's how many times I have to blink after waking up to a day full of very, very strange rituals. Now, careful not to get out of my bed with the wrong foot, and I am off to some algebra. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Most people think that OCD means obsessively washing your hands and trying to align everything. Trust me, things are about to get a lot more fucked up as we carry on. Now it's time to attempt leaving the house. I start by lifting my hand off the doorknob using a very specific slow movement. I enter the elevator and I stop it, obviously. You didn't think I'd leave without checking the door, did you? Don't be silly. I'll be back. At least twice. Yeah, there it is. I go down, I enter the car, doing pretty well so far, no intrusive thoughts for the past 30 seconds, think I'm going very combo here. And then Mr. Satan comes along and whispers into my ear, "Did you check the window step slides, Power?" And I reply, "Yes, Mr. Satan, I did. But I have to go back and I have to check, otherwise I get the feeling something terrible might happen." I love to eat, but I am pretty sure that if loaves of bread with unevenly spread butter were the only food available on earth, I would starve to death. I also avoid certain meals just because they have a weird texture that reminds me of worms, and I have to touch specific objects many times until it feels just right. But now that I think of it, that sounded weirdly sexual, so please don't take this out of context. Anyway, here comes the messed up part. I get these terrible urges to ride off the road, hit a tree, jump off the bridge, run over my ex-boyfriend, and then I am sitting there wondering, am I really capable of doing all these things? I don't want to die necessarily, I don't want to kill anyone, though my ex is asking for it. And you might be sitting there thinking, sweet Jesus, how do I file a restraining order against this crazy bitch? And I can't really blame you, but let me explain how intrusive thoughts work. Most of us get them, but normal people leave them behind and they cheerfully get back to watching funny cat videos online. Now, if you have OCD, you will start picking each thought apart, and the next thing you know, you are stuck with a bunch of new rituals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, that make you look like you are high on acid. And there is a part of me that knows all of this is utterly stupid and pointless, but giving in and, performing some witchcraft is always so much easier than having to face the terrible thoughts my mind projects. I'm 27 and I am scared to death if I leave my bathroom door open. I'd really like to be in charge, but at the end of the day I know I just can't stop.
Ever hear a really good joke about polio? Or made a casual reference to someone having hepatitis? Or maybe teased your buddy by saying he has muscular dystrophy? Of course you have never done that, because you are not a terrible person. You'd never make fun of someone for having a physical illness. But folks make all kinds of offhand remarks about people having mental illnesses and never give it a second thought. How often have you heard a person say that someone's psycho or schizo or bipolar or OCD? I can pretty much guarantee that the people who use those terms had no idea what they actually meant. We've talked about how psychological disorders and the people who have them have often been stigmatized, but at the same time, we tend to minimize those disorders, using them as nicknames for things that people do, think, or say that may not exactly be universal, but are still basically healthy. And we all do it, but only because we don't really understand those conditions. But that's why we're here, because as we go deeper into psychological disorders, we get a clearer understanding of their symptoms, types, causes, and the perspectives that help explain them. And some of the most common disorders have their root in an unpleasant mental state that's familiar to us all: anxiety. It's a part of being human, but for some people it can develop into intense fear and paralyzing dread and ultimately turn into full-fledged anxiety disorder. Defining psychological disorders again: a deviant, distressful, dysfunctional pattern of thoughts, feelings, or behaviors that interferes with the ability to function in a healthy way. So when it comes to anxiety, that definition is the difference between the guy you probably called phobic because he didn't like Space Mountain as much as you did, and the person who truly can't leave their house for fear of interacting with others. It's the difference between the girl who's teased by her friends as being OCD because she does her laundry every night, and the girl who has to wash her hands so often that they bleed. Starting today, you're gonna understand all those terms you've been using. We commonly equate anxiety with fear, but anxiety disorders aren't just a matter of fear itself. A key component is also what we do to get rid of that fear. Say someone almost drowned as a kid and is now afraid of water. A family picnic at the river may cause that anxiety to bubble up, and to cope, they may stay sequestered in the car, less anxious but probably still unhappy while the rest of the family is having fun. So in clinical terms, anxiety disorders are characterized not only by distressing, persistent anxiety, but also often by the dysfunctional behaviors that reduce that anxiety. At least a fifth of all people will experience a diagnosable anxiety disorder of some kind at some point in their lives. That is a lot of us. So I want to start out with a condition that used to be categorized as an anxiety disorder, but is now considered complex enough to be in a class by itself: obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD. You probably know that condition is characterized by unwanted, repetitive thoughts, which become obsessions, which are sometimes accompanied by actions, which become compulsions. And it is a great example of a psychological disorder that could use some mental health myth-busting. Being neat and orderly and fastidious does not make you OCD. OCD is a debilitating condition whose sufferers take normal behaviors like washing your hands or double-checking that you turned off the stove and perform them compulsively. And they often use these compulsive, even ritualistic behaviors to relieve intense and unbearable anxiety. So soon they're scrubbing their hands every 5 minutes, or constantly checking the stove, or counting the exact number of steps they take everywhere they go. If you're still unclear about what it means for disorders to be deviant, distressful, and dysfunctional, OCD might help you understand. Because it is hard to keep a job, run a household, sit still, or do much of anything if you feel intensely compelled to run to the kitchen 20 times an hour. And both the thoughts and behaviors associated with OCD are often driven by a fear that is itself obsessive, like if you don't go to the kitchen right now, your house will burn down and your child will die, which makes the condition that much more distressing and self-reinforcing. There are treatments that help OCD, including certain kinds of psychotherapy and some psychotropic drugs. But the key here is that it is not a description for your roommate who cleans her bathroom twice a week, or the guy in the cubicle next to you who only likes to use green felt tip pens. And even though OCD is considered its own unique set of psychological issues, the pervasive senses of fear, worry, and loss of control that often accompany it have a lot in common with other anxiety disorders. The broadest of these is generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD. People with this condition tend to feel continually tense and apprehensive, experiencing unfocused, negative, and out-of-control feelings. Of course, feeling this way occasionally is common enough, but feeling it consistently for over 6 months, the length of time required for a formal diagnosis, is not. Folks with GAD worry all the time and are frequently agitated and on edge, but unlike some other kinds of anxiety, patients often can't identify what's causing the anxiousness, so they don't even know what to avoid. Then there's panic disorder, which affects about 1 in 75 people, most often teens and young adults. Its calling card is panic attacks, or sudden episodes of intense dread or sudden fear that come without warning. Unlike the symptoms of GAD, which can be hard to pin down, panic attacks are brief, well-defined, and sometimes severe bouts of elevated anxiety. And if you've ever had one or been with someone who has, you know that they call these attacks for good reason. They can cause chest pains and racing heartbeat, difficulty breathing, and a general sense that you're going crazy or even dying. It's as awful as it sounds. We've talked a lot about the body's physiological fight or flight response, and that's definitely part of what's going on here, even though there often isn't an obvious trigger. There may be a genetic predisposition to panic disorder, but persistent stress or having experienced psychological trauma in the past can also set you up for these attacks. And because the attacks themselves can be downright terrifying, a common trigger for panic disorder is simply the fear of having another panic attack. How's that for a kick in the head? Say you have a panic attack on a bus, so you find yourself hyperventilating in front of dozens of strangers with nowhere to go to calm yourself down. That whole ordeal might make you never want to be in that situation again, so your anxiety could lead you to start avoiding crowded or confined places. At this point, the initial anxiety has spun off into a fear of anxiety, which means, welcome, you've migrated into another realm of anxiety disorder: phobias. And again, this is a term that's been misused for a long time to describe people who say don't like cats or are uncomfortable on long plane trips. Simply experiencing fear or discomfort doesn't make you phobic. In clinical terms, phobias are persistent, irrational fears of specific objects, activities, or situations that also, and this is important, leads to avoidance behavior. You hear a lot about fears of heights or spiders or clowns, and those are real things. They're specific phobias that focus on particular objects or situations. For example, the Chesapeake Bay Bridge in Maryland is a 7,000-meter span that crosses the Chesapeake Bay. If you want to get to or from eastern Maryland, that's pretty much the only way to do it, at least in a car. But there are thousands of people who are so afraid of crossing that bridge that they simply can't do it. So to accommodate this avoidance behavior, driver's services are available. For $25, people with gephyrophobia, a fear of bridges, can hire someone to drive themselves and their kids and dogs and groceries across the the bridge in their own car while trying not to freak out. But other phobias lack such specific triggers. What we might think of as social phobia, currently known as social anxiety disorder, is characterized by anxiety related to interacting or being seen by others, which could be triggered by a phone call or being called on in class or just thinking about meeting new people. So you can probably see at this point how anxiety disorders are related and how they can be difficult to tease apart. The same thing can be said about what we think causes them. Because much in the same way that anxiety can show up as both a feeling, like panic, and a thought, like, is my kitchen on fire, there are also two main perspectives on how we currently view anxiety, as a function of both learning and biology. The learning perspective suggests that things like conditioning and observational learning and cognition, all of which we've talked about before, best explain the source of our anxiety. Remember our behaviorist friend John B. Watson and his conditioning experiments with poor little Albert? By making a loud, scary noise every time he showed the kid a white rat, he ended up conditioning the boy to fear any furry object, from bunnies to dogs to fur coats. That conditioning used two specific learning processes to cement itself in little Albert's young mind. Stimulus generalization expanded or generalized his fear of the rat to other furry objects. The same principle holds true if you were attacked by your neighbor's mean parrot and subsequently fear all birds. But then the anxiety is solidified through reinforcement. Every time you avoid or escape a feared situation, a pair of fuzzy slippers or a robin on the street, you ease your anxiety, which might make you feel better temporarily, but it actually reinforces your phobic behavior, making it stronger. Cognition also influences our anxiety, whether we interpret a strange noise outside as a hungry bear or robber or merely the wind, determines if we roll over and keep snoring or freak out and run for a kitchen knife. And we might also acquire anxiety from other people through observational learning. A parent who's terrified of water may end up instilling that fear in their child by violently snatching them away from kiddie pools or generally acting anxious around park fountains and duck ponds. But there are also equally important biological perspectives. Natural selection, for instance, might explain why we seem more likely to fear certain potentially dangerous animals like snakes, or why fears of heights or closed-in spaces are relatively common. It's probably true that our more wary ancestors who had the sense to stay away from cliff edges and hissing serpents were more likely to live another day and pass along their genes, so this might explain why those fears can persist, and why even people who live in places without poisonous snakes would still fear snakes anyway. And then you got the genetics and the brain chemistry to consider. Research has shown, for example, that identical twins, those eternal test subjects, are more likely to develop similar phobias even if they're raised apart. Some researchers have detected 17 different genes that seem to be expressed with various anxiety disorders, so it may be that some folks are just naturally more anxious than others, and they might pass on that quality to their kids. And of course, individual brains have a lot to say about how they process anxiety. Physiologically, people who experience panic attacks, generalized anxiety, or obsessive compulsions show over-arousal in the areas of the brain that deal with impulse control and habitual behaviors. Now, we don't know whether these irregularities cause the disorder or caused by it, but again, it reinforces the truism that everything that is psychological is simultaneously biological. And that holds true for many other psychological disorders we'll talk about in the coming weeks, many of which have names that you've also heard being misused in the past. Today, you learned what defines an anxiety disorder, as well as the symptoms of obsessive-compulsive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, and phobias. You also learned about the two main perspectives on the origins of anxiety disorders, the learning perspective and the biological perspective, and hopefully you learned not to use OCD as a punchline from now on. Thanks for watching, especially to all of our Subbable subscribers who make Crash Course available to them and also to everyone else. To find out how you can become a supporter, just go to subbable.com/crashcourse. This episode was written by Kathleen Yale, edited by Blake DiPastino, and our consultant is Dr. Ranjit Bhagwat. Our director and editor is Nicholas Jenkins. The script supervisor is Michael Ronda, who is also our sound designer, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.